Psychology in Seattle.
Hey, deserving listeners. Today I'm going to do a deep dive on schema therapy. I find schema therapy to be a good theory. I like it. It's practical, but it also can be very deep. I think it's very useful. It provides very specific examples. It's not this very amorphous theory, psychodynamic theory, for example, which I love, can be quite amorphous sometimes. Whereas schema therapy provides a very specific guidance on figuring out what one's issues are and how to help them. And I've known about schema therapy for a long time, and I've known the basic premise of it and thought I would like it, as it's an integrative theory of several theories that I like. But I didn't realize I would like it this much. I really, really like it. And if I would have discovered this theory early in my career, I might have eventually considered myself a schema therapist, because it really is in line with the way that I think about people, and it has enough in there, enough integrated in there that it's not narrow and limited. And at this point in my career, I just have my own identity, and so it's kind of silly to switch course at this point. Plus, I feel like I've been operating as a schema therapist for 20 years anyway, having integrated other kinds of things. But anyway, yeah, I like schema therapy so much that I'm pretty sure I'm going to start integrating it into some of my courses at my university, particularly in my course on family of origin, which I have novice graduate students analyze themselves and their family of origin, their childhood, to discover their vulnerabilities as a person and as a therapist, so that they can understand their vulnerabilities when they are sitting with their clients. And schema therapy provides a pretty distinct, systematic way. They even have measures that you can, surveys, instruments you can fill out that you can actually discover what your issues are, what your maladaptive schemas are. And I have been doing this kind of work with my students anyway to help them discover their issues in relation that that their clients will trigger in them. But I think that schema therapy provides this very systematic way of figuring that out. So I'm going to actually go through that in this episode. And along those lines, I think this episode is going to be useful to you all. At least that's my way of trying to design this. In the past, I have done deep dives like this, and I probably get 95% of the stuff out there. But then some people will email me afterwards and they'll say, okay, I feel like I really understand the theory well. I feel like I, really understand the foundation and the research, but how am I supposed to use it? And I've always sort of resisted that, because I'm like, well, go to therapy. But I don't actually believe that you need to go to therapy in order to help yourself. I mean, I have helped myself without necessarily going to therapy. I've gone to therapy most of my life, so I, enjoy therapy. But sometimes it's like I probably am better off just doing some things on my own. And so I'm going to provide a step-by-step process in this episode at the end, walking through how one could use schema therapy within reason on themselves to better themselves. Because I think that that's absolutely possible. Now, if you're beyond a certain level of difficulty, then you absolutely would need a therapist to help you walk through that. But I'll make that distinction toward the end of the episode. So throughout this episode, what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide little moments where I'm going to ask that you actually pause the podcast and take some notes, because it can get kind of complicated. And so if you take notes as you go along, I think it'll help you to actually discover some things about yourself. I mean, when I walked through all this stuff, I discovered some things about myself. I even gave the instrument to my wife, and I discovered some things about her. I don't know if she discovered anything new about herself, but maybe a little bit. It's interesting. It's interesting to be like, oh, okay, I guess I am that way. I never thought of that as different than other people. Is that a different thing? Everyone isn't like that. So Yeah, so I'm going to walk through a step-by-step process of the schemas, the coping styles, the modes, and so on. So, I think you'll find it interesting. It's another way of looking at personality disorders. A lot of you want me to talk about personality disorders for various different reasons. Some of you actually suffer from personality disorders. And schema therapy is another way of looking at personality and its disorders. It's not really connected to the DSM categories, the traditional categories of personality disorders that we have in our field, like borderline narcissism, this kind of thing. I think it in some ways it's more useful than the DSM categories because it's more descriptive and perhaps using more contemporary language than in the past. Because, our DSM categories come from over 100 years ago in some ways. I mean, histrionic personality disorder comes from thousands of years ago, back in the ancient Greeks and even further back with the ancient Egyptians. So it's just, just as a short side note there, histrionic personality disorder, the word hyster is the Greek word for uterus, which was the thought back then was that if your uterus was wandering around your body, then you would have this disorder. Of course, it was a sexist thing that only women could suffer from. And the Greeks got that idea from ancient Egyptians. So in the DSM, we still have this word called histrionic personality disorder. I mean, I use the term because it's the way of describing it to other clinicians. I wish we had a different term. I wish we called it something like, attention deficit or, deprived attention personality disorder or something. But anyway, the schema therapy provides just a new language system that's more intuitive, more understandable, and it's still in depth though. In some ways, it's more, if you look at it a certain way, it's even more in depth than the DSM language of personality. So if you're a clinician, I think you'll find this particularly useful because it's a helpful way of looking at clients and their patterns. I have 41 pages of notes, so I think this is going to be a very long episode. Now, I asked the listeners what they thought of schema therapy today. I just posted on Facebook and on Patreon. I was like, I'm doing a deep dive on schema therapy. Does anyone have any experience with it? And some people wrote in. CW wrote in and said, I am looking for a therapist who does schema therapy in my area, but my worry is that it will annoy me if it gets too Freudian. But it is supposed to help me with my disorganized attachment style, which is becoming untenable for me and my personal and work relationships. The theory is clear and intuitive, I think. However, I don't like the position of the therapist as parent or the dismissing of hurt parts as being stuck at the ego state, which was once told to me by a schema therapist. I remember feeling angry and resentful of that label of being stuck in an ego state. If I could, I would go to an internal family systems therapist, but they are not recognized in my country. End of comment. So interesting that you think you're worried that schema therapy would become too Freudian and that you're looking for a IFS therapist and they don't have them in your country. If you want a deep dive on internal family systems, you can listen to one of my older episodes in which I do a deep dive on that. I actually interviewed someone who does it a long time ago, probably, 8 years ago or something. Elizabeth wrote in, I'm about to start schema therapy now. I filled out the YSQ measure and we discussed my results. I've had an intake with a new psychologist and we'll have our first real session this Wednesday. Angel also commented, as a client, I have had schema mode therapy based on the conceptualization that Arnold Arntz formulated. It differs from traditional schema therapy in that it focuses on the modes found in personality disorders rather than the schemas. I have had DBT, CBT, and a bit of ACT and compassion-focused therapy. I have found schema mode therapy with the addition of compassion work to be the most healing. My psychologist doesn't use it exclusively, but we come back to it for times and issues that I find myself really stuck. So I just thought it was interesting to hear people talk about it because I was surprised that people are actually seeking it, that therapists are actually using schema therapy. I don't think a lot of people in Seattle are using it, maybe a lot, but not in my circle anyway. I think it's great that people are using it, but I was just surprised at its prevalence. Maybe it's more prevalent in other areas of the world. I'm not quite sure. So in this episode, I'm gonna talk about the theory in detail, as I usually like to do. I love theory and I love talking about it. I love trying to really understand it, not just sort of the outline of it all. I want to really look at schema therapy in a detailed way. I also want to, again, explain how everyone can use it for themselves, for self-awareness and for healing. And I'll provide some concrete steps for that. Again, within reason, meaning that if you suffer beyond a certain threshold, you absolutely need a therapist to help you. I'm also going to talk about how schema therapy works, and then I'm going to conclude with some research and some final thoughts. This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor. This episode is just for patrons of the podcast, so if you want to hear this full episode, which I'm guessing is going to be hours and hours long, you have to become a patron of the podcast by going to patreon.com. That's patreon.com. When you become a patron, you get access to this episode and hundreds of other patron-only episodes, which are arguably our best episodes. Also, know that a portion of your monthly pledge goes towards various charities that we support. We've given over $10,000 to various charities and causes, and we've actually given out almost $5,000 in scholarships to needy students who are making a difference in the world. So know that your money's going towards a lot of really great things. So go to patreon.com and become a patron of our podcast. Join us. Be one of us.